You need to learn your place in this house. That was the first thing he said to me. Not hello, not nice to meet you, not even a nod. Just that, delivered over the rim of his coffee mug like I was a new recruit who'd shown up late to formation. I had just driven 11 hours straight from Fort Bragg. My duffel was still in the trunk of my car. I hadn't eaten since a gas station granola bar somewhere outside of Raleigh. And my mother's boyfriend was already telling me my place. His name was Dale. Dale Whitmore, 53 years old, ex-Army, discharged at the rank of Staff Sergeant after 12 years. He'd been dating my mother for 8 months. He had moved into her house, the one she'd owned outright since my grandmother passed and left it to her, about 6 weeks after they started seeing each other. My mother's name is Patricia. Most people call her Pat. She taught middle school science for 27 years in Greenville, North Carolina. She has a laugh that fills up a room and a habit of keeping every birthday card anyone has ever sent her in a shoebox under her bed. She is the most genuinely good person I have ever known, and she had absolutely no idea what she had let through her front door. I'm Claire Novak. I was 31 years old at the time this happened. I am a major in the United States Army, currently assigned to the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I have a law degree from the University of Virginia. I have handled courts-martial, contract disputes, and more than one situation that required me to sit across from someone who thought their rank gave them the right to behave however they pleased. I am telling you this not to brag. I am telling you this because it matters later. It matters a lot. I had come home for Thanksgiving. 3 days. That was all I had. 3 days of leave before I had to be back on base. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. My mother's cornbread stuffing, her sweet potato casserole, her old ceramic turkey centerpiece that she pulls out of the hall closet every November, the one with the chipped beak that she refuses to throw away because my brother painted it when he was 7. What I walked into was something else entirely. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside. Not bad, exactly. Just off. Like a familiar song played in the wrong key. My mother's reading chair had been moved from its spot by the window to the far corner of the living room. The television, which she'd always kept on the local news in the evenings, was tuned to a football pregame show at full volume. There were 2 empty beer cans on the coffee table, not in the trash. On the table. My mother came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel and hugged me so tight I could feel her exhale against my shoulder. She looked tired in a way that wasn't just fatigue. It was the kind of tired that comes from keeping your face arranged in a certain expression for too long. Dale's in the living room, she said, like she was warning me about weather. He didn't get up when I walked in. He glanced over from the couch, gave me a slow once-over, and said, "You need to learn your place in this house," and went back to the game. I stood there for a moment. I thought maybe I'd misheard him. I looked at my mother, who was doing something very careful with her eyes, looking at the middle distance, not at me, not at him. "I'm sorry," I said. "Your mom works hard," he said, still not looking at me. "When you visit, you contribute. You don't just show up and expect to be waited on." He picked up one of the beer cans, realized it was empty, set it back down. I run a tight house. I want to be clear about something. In that moment, I did not say what I wanted to say. I did not say what 12 years of military service had trained me to say when someone in authority oversteps. I smiled. I said, "Good to meet you too, Dale." I picked up my duffel and went upstairs to my old room. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, same blue comforter, same poster of the Appalachian Trail on the wall, and I called my brother. His name is Ryan. He lives in Charlotte. He'd heard things secondhand from my mother. Vague things, but he hadn't visited since Dale moved in. "How bad is it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me in 3 days." I knew by the next morning. I came downstairs at 6:30 to find Dale already at the kitchen table with a full plate of eggs, toast, and bacon that my mother had clearly made for him. My mother was still at the stove. She hadn't eaten yet. She was refilling his orange juice when I walked in, and he didn't look up from his phone. "You cook?" he asked me, still reading whatever was on his screen. "I can," I said. "Good. Pat works too hard for someone your age to just sit around." He finally looked up. "You can make yourself useful while you're here. Gutters need cleaning, backyard's a mess, and the guest bathroom needs recalking." I've been meaning to get to it for weeks. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the stove. Dale, I said very carefully. This is my mother's house. And I live here, he said. Which makes it my house too. Your mother understands that. That sentence, your mother understands that, landed like a stone in still water. I watched the ripple cross her face. She understood nothing of the sort. She had simply stopped arguing, which is not the same thing, and he had mistaken her silence for agreement. That is a very old trick, and it is usually performed by people who know exactly what they're doing. He left after breakfast to go somewhere. He was vague about it, just meeting some guys, which I later learned meant the VFW hall, where he spent a significant portion of most days, and I sat down across from my mother at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. Mom, I said. He's just particular, she said. He told me to clean the gutters. He means well. I had heard this before, not about Dale specifically, but about men like Dale. I had sat across from more than one junior soldier's spouse who had used exactly that phrase about someone who most definitely did not mean well. He means well is what people say when they've run out of other explanations. How long has he been talking to you like that? I asked. She wrapped both hands around her mug. It's not that simple, Claire. I didn't ask if it was simple. She told me then, slowly, in the careful way she tells things she hasn't said out loud before. Dale had moved in gradually, first a few nights a week, then weekends, then he'd stopped going back to his apartment at all. He told her his lease was up. She hadn't asked to see the lease. He'd started referring to the house as our place in conversations with other people, which she found uncomfortable but hadn't corrected because she didn't want to make a scene. He wasn't paying rent, he wasn't contributing to utilities, he wasn't covering groceries. He was, she told me in a voice barely above a whisper, using her credit card, sometimes for things she hadn't agreed to. Gas, meals out, a new set of golf clubs that were currently in the garage. He had a pension. He was receiving military retirement pay, not enormous. Staff sergeant, 12 years, but enough. There was no financial reason for any of this, which meant this was not about money. I knew what it was about. I had seen it before in different rooms with different names on the paperwork. I spent the rest of that day being useful in the way I chose to be useful, which did not include the gutters or the guest bathroom. I went through every financial statement my mother would show me. I called her credit card company from the backyard. I took photographs of the golf clubs with my phone. I had a very long and careful conversation with a friend of mine who is a civilian family law attorney in Raleigh. By the time Dale came home that evening, smelling like bar food and Budweiser, I had a fairly complete picture. He dropped onto the couch and looked at me in the armchair. I had moved it back to its spot by the window and said, "You're still here." 3 days, I said pleasantly. That was the plan, he grunted. Pat says you're some kind of lawyer in the Army. JAG Corps, I said. Yes. He made a sound that I can only describe as dismissive. JAG. Right, so you sit in an office and push paper. Sometimes, I said, real Army is nothing like that. He picked up the remote. No offense, I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that no offense almost always precedes the thing someone most wants you to take offense at, and that the correct response is usually to let it land without reaction. It tends to frustrate people more than any comeback. He turned on the television. I went to help my mother with dinner. The next morning was Thanksgiving. My mother had been up since 5. I found her in the kitchen in her old green robe with flour on her hands and the radio on low, and for a moment, standing in the doorway watching her move around that kitchen the way she'd moved around it my entire life. I felt something close to grief, the anticipatory kind, the kind you feel when you can see what something is becoming and you're not sure you can stop it. I put on coffee and helped her with the stuffing, and we talked about Ryan and his kids, and whether my Aunt Deborah was going to bring her new boyfriend to Christmas and all the normal things, and it was almost exactly like every Thanksgiving I could remember. Then Dale came downstairs. He had apparently invited 2 friends. This was the first my mother had heard of it. They arrived at 11, 2 men around Dale's age, both loud, both treating my mother's house with the casual familiarity of people who'd been told they were welcome without anyone actually telling them that. One of them left his boots in the middle of the entryway. The other opened the refrigerator without asking and helped himself to a beer at 11 in the morning. Dale moved through the house like he owned it. He redirected where people sat. He told my mother the turkey needed more time when she said it was ready. He interrupted her twice when she was speaking. At one point he said in front of his friends, "Pat, what did I tell you about the thermostat?" and she got it quietly and turned it down 2 degrees. I was sitting very still at the kitchen table. There is a thing that happens in me sometimes, in moments like that. Something settles. Not anger. Anger is hot and loud and easy to misdirect. This was something colder and much more deliberate. I felt it in courtrooms. I've felt it in rooms where someone was certain they were the most powerful person present. I excused myself after dinner. I went upstairs. I opened my duffel bag, the one still mostly unpacked from 2 days ago, and I took out my dress uniform. Army service uniform, the blues. I had brought it because I always bring it, habit, preparation. The same reason I always have a legal pad in my bag and a copy of my orders in my wallet. I laid it out on the bed and I looked at it for a moment. The rank insignia on the shoulder, Major, gold oak leaf. I thought about Dale's staff sergeant stripes. Then I thought about the credit card statements. The golf clubs in the garage. My mother turning down the thermostat when he told her to. I got dressed. It takes me less than 4 minutes to put on my dress uniform correctly. I have done it enough times that my hands know the sequence without my brain having to direct them. I stood in front of my mother's old mirror, the one with the slightly warped glass that makes everything look just slightly dreamlike, and I looked at myself. Blues pressed, brass polished, oak leaf on the shoulder. I went downstairs. Dale was in the living room with his 2 friends. My mother was in the kitchen. I walked through the kitchen first. She turned around from the sink and went completely still. "Claire," she said in a voice I couldn't quite categorize. "I'm okay, Mom," I said. "Go sit in the living room. I want to tell you that I had some dramatic speech prepared. I didn't. I've found, in my professional experience, that people who have a lot to say in situations of confrontation usually have less actual authority than they believe they do. The people who genuinely hold the power tend not to need to say very much." I walked into the living room. Dale looked up. His friends looked up. There was a half second. I've seen it happen before, in offices and courtrooms, and once in a very difficult meeting with a 2-star general, where everyone in a room recalibrates, where the visual information reaches the brain before the social interpretation does, and for just a moment, no one knows exactly what to say. Dale recovered first, which surprised me. I'll give him that. "What's this about?" he said. "I wanted to have a conversation," I said, "and I thought it would be clearest if everyone understood exactly who they were talking to." One of his friends, the one who'd had the 11 a.m. beer, leaned over and said something to the other one, quiet. The other one nodded slowly. Dale stood up. I think he thought that would help. Standing for men like Dale is an assertion. It says, "I am taking this seriously, and I am bigger than you." He looked at my rank insignia. I watched his face do the math. "Staff Sergeant to Major is 4 grades. "You're a major," he said. "That's correct." There was a silence. In that silence, I could hear my mother in the kitchen, not moving. "Okay," Dale said. His voice had changed. Not much, but enough. So I said, "I need you to understand something. You are living in my mother's home. Not your home. Hers. She holds the deed. Her name is on every piece of paper attached to this property. You have no legal standing here, and more to the point, you have no right, zero, none, to speak to her the way you have been speaking to her, or to use her accounts without her explicit, documented consent." His jaw moved. "That's a crime, Dale," I said. "Using someone's credit card without authorization. That's not a civil matter. That is a criminal matter. I have the statements, I have the amounts, I have a documented record going back 4 months. She gave me permission. She told me she didn't." I kept my voice exactly level. "She told me this morning. Would you like to have that conversation with her directly in front of me, and we can see what she says?" One of his friends stood up. Not in a threatening way, in a we should probably go kind of way. "Dale," the Beard 11 friend said quietly. Dale looked at me for a long moment. I have been looked at like that before. I know what it is. It is the look of someone recalculating their position and not liking the numbers. "This is between me and Pat," he said. "It stopped being just between you and Pat," I said. "When you used her visa to buy a $300 set of golf clubs that are currently in her garage, and when you started treating her home like it was yours to manage, and when you told her what temperature to keep her own house." Behind me, I heard my mother come to the kitchen doorway. I didn't turn around. "Dale," she said. And then, and this is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life, she didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Her voice had something in it I had not heard in 2.5 days. Something that sounded like herself. Dale's friends left first. They made their excuses quietly and got their coats and were out the front door in under 3 minutes. Dale stood in the middle of the living room for a moment longer, looking like a man trying to find an exit that didn't exist. "I'll get my things," he said finally. "There's no rush tonight," I said, "but I'd suggest you make arrangements within the week. If it would help, I can put that in writing." He looked at me one more time. Then he walked upstairs. My mother and I sat in the kitchen and didn't say much for a while. She made more coffee. Outside it was getting dark, the way it gets dark in November in North Carolina, fast and total, like someone pulling a curtain. "I didn't know how to make him leave," she finally said. "I know," I said. "I kept thinking it would just change, that he'd go back to being who he was when we first met. That person probably wasn't completely real," I said as gently as I could. She nodded. She already knew that. She had knew that. She'd known it for a while. Sometimes knowing something and being able to act on it are separated by a distance that other people can't see from the outside. He was gone by Sunday morning. He took his clothes, his toiletries, and his golf clubs. I stood in the doorway of the garage when he loaded those, which I think communicated something without requiring words. He didn't speak to me. He said goodbye to my mother in a voice that was trying to be dignified and mostly got there. The door closed. My mother stood at the window and watched his truck back out of the driveway. Then she turned around and said, "I'm moving my chair back." I laughed. I couldn't help it. She laughed too, the real laugh, the one that fills up a room, and it was the best sound I had heard in 3 days. I called my family law attorney friend that evening and walked my mother through her options regarding the credit card charges. She ultimately decided to send Dale a formal demand letter for reimbursement rather than pursue criminal charges. That was her decision to make, and I made sure she understood it was hers. He paid. Not immediately, and not without a follow-up letter. But he paid. I filed the paperwork with the credit card company to have him removed as an authorized contact. I made sure my mother had the number for a local family advocate organization in Greenville. People she could call if she ever needed to talk through something similar in the future. I made her show me all her accounts before I left. My last morning there, she made the cornbread stuffing and re-ate it for breakfast, which is something we used to do when I was a kid, and which we had not done this particular Thanksgiving because Dale had announced he didn't like cornbread. We sat at the kitchen table in the morning light, with bowls of stuffing and cups of coffee, and my mother told me about a student she has. She subs now, a few days a week, retired but restless. A 7th grader who is apparently a natural at chemistry and reminds her of herself at that age. I drove back to Fort Bragg with the windows down even though it was 40 degrees. I needed the air. Here's what I want to say. To anyone who has watched someone they love shrink themselves to fit around another person, the space they leave behind when they do that is not nothing. It accumulates. It becomes a kind of debt, not of money, but of self. And it compounds the longer it goes unpaid. My mother is not a person who needed rescuing. She is the most capable woman I know. What she needed was for someone to walk into that room and make it undeniably, visually, legally clear that the terms Dale had quietly renegotiated were not the actual terms, that the contract he thought he'd established was not one anyone had signed. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone willing to be clear about who they actually are. The chair is back by the window. The thermostat stays where she sets it. She called me last week to tell me she'd bought a new coffee maker, the expensive kind she'd been eyeing for 2 years, but never got because Dale said it was a waste of money. I used his reimbursement check, she said. I told her that was the most satisfying thing I'd heard all month. She laughed, the real one. I've thought a lot about that Thanksgiving since it happened, not the confrontation part. That part was actually the simplest thing that happened all weekend. What I think about is the drive home. Windows down, 40 degrees, the highway stretching out in front of me through the dark, and this strange quiet feeling in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. I think what it was cause and effect finally catching up to itself. Dale didn't lose because I outranked him. That's the part people get wrong when I tell this story. He lost because of a pattern he'd been building for months, the small takeovers, the silence he'd mistaken for permission, the slow erosion of my mother's confidence in her own judgment. Every one of those choices was a brick he laid in a wall he eventually couldn't see over. By the time I walked into that living room, the outcome had already been determined. I just showed up to confirm it. That's how it actually works, I think. Not dramatically, not with a single turning point, but as accumulation. The things we do when we believe no one is paying attention are exactly the things that define us when someone finally does. Dale had been defining himself for 8 months in that house. He just hadn't considered that one day, someone would walk in and read the full picture. My mother is not a woman who needed someone to fight her battles. I want to be careful about that, because there is a version of this story where she's the victim and I'm the rescuer, and that flattens both of us. What she needed was time and information, and the specific kind of clarity that's hard to find when you're inside a situation and doing the daily work of managing it. She knew something was wrong. She just hadn't yet found the ground to stand on. That's the thing about integrity. Your own, not someone else's. It doesn't vanish when someone pressures it. It goes quiet sometimes. It waits. But it doesn't leave. When my mother said Dale's name in that doorway, just his name and nothing else, that was her integrity speaking. 12 years of teaching, a house she'd earned, a life she'd built. None of that had actually disappeared. It had just been temporarily crowded out by someone louder than he had any right to be. I think about the golf club sometimes. $300 on her visa for clubs he used maybe twice, bought with money that wasn't his to spend. It's such a small, specific act of contempt, the kind of thing that reveals exactly what a person thinks of you, not in a loud moment, but in a quiet one, when they believe the transaction will go unnoticed. Those quiet moments tell the whole truth. What I keep coming back to is this: the life you build through actual work, actual competence, actual care for the people around you. That doesn't make you invulnerable to people who want to take advantage of it, but it does mean that when you finally decide enough is enough, you have something real to stand on. My mother had her deed, her name, her history in that house. I had my record, my training, my understanding of exactly what the law says about what Dale had done. Neither of us had to invent anything. We just had to be willing to use what was already true. He paid back every dollar. She bought the coffee maker she'd wanted for 2 years. I think that's what it looks like when things actually balance out. Not dramatic, not loud, just the right person finally, setting their own thermostat.